But why do we get this resistance to this economic common sense? It goes back essentially to what you can characterise as Reaganite Tea Party rants, that all deficit and debt is inherently bad. That's why they have spent so much time trying to demonise the actions that we took through the global financial crisis. Economically correct, economically effective, with the most spectacular results achieved by any developed economy in the Western world. But that's why they don't like it, because this isn't so much an argument about economics, it's an argument about the role of government. And their demonisation of deficit and debt has a much more insidious purpose. And that insidious purpose is they don't think that government should play any role in a modern economy. And we should really just hand the whole lot over to the business sector. And government should simply shrink away so we have some brutal survival of the fittest ideology that dominates the way our country works, grows and interacts. Now that's a philosophy that progressives reject, but of course demonising deficit and debt goes to the very core of a political strategy. And that's why you constantly hear this mantra chant about Labor, deficit, debt, GFC, all the rest of it. This dominant ideology has to be challenged economically. It has to be challenged much more forcefully and forthrightly than it has been to date. And you would be right to say to me, well, why did you not challenge this in government? And the answer is I did. I did for just about every one of the 2,000 days that I was Treasurer of Australia. But the fact is, something else is happening in our politics. And that is the Americanisation of the right in this country. And what I would call the radicalisation of the plutocratic elite who are conservative and now dominate so many of the responsible business organisations in this country that once were up for some sort of collective discussion about how we might grow the country together. And what I began to experience as Treasurer of Australia in the aftermath of the global financial crisis was the flexing of the muscles of these people, which is why I wrote in 2012 my essay, the 0.01%, the growing power of vested interests in our country. We have seen a real radicalisation of the right in Australia in parallel to what actually happened in the US with the Tea Party. And they do now flex their muscles like never before. And we ran smack bang into it in government in the very first instance when almost the lead action of our government as we were dealing with the global financial crisis was to abolish work choices and to put in place the Fair Work Act. That decision, more than any other taken by our government during that period, antagonised, radicalised and mobilised the conservative right in this country. It's hard to imagine it, but back in 2007, it's hard to think that in that election campaign, for example, all Murdoch papers, bar one or two, editorialised for Labor. Could anyone imagine that happening today? This is just one example of what has become a very active, very powerful group of people, symbolised, if you like, by some of the mining magnates, backed up by what is now increasingly an enriched, technocratic and economically conservative corporate elite, who now really do want to make a country where you don't have a decent minimum wage. Has anyone ever wondered why we spend so much time in our economic debate arguing over penalty rates, for example? Because their only solution, their enduring solution, is to tip the balance between labour and capital in the economy. And the rest, as far as they're concerned, doesn't matter. They're not up for a decent policy to deal with climate change. They're not up for tougher bank regulation and dealing with things like exorbitant credit card rates. They're not up for any structural change, which might in the short term disadvantage them economically, but in the long term helps grow the pie and the country. So this is the challenge we face. The recent Queensland election result was probably the most stunning outcome in my life, in my whole political life. To see that elite beaten in an election when everything was running their way, bar the Queensland Premier. It is possible to beat this juggernaut, but understand it is bigger and more powerful and more undemocratic than it's ever been, since the Depression. Has an entitled mentality that they ought to run the country. And what that means in the end politically is it's really important that those of us who see ourselves as progressives unite in the face of what is something profoundly undemocratic, which is happening in our political system. And all of that joins the budget, if you like, to the reaction of that elite to what we did in the global financial crisis. Labor got offside with those groups during that period because we did what was right for the country, but it didn't suit them. And we now live with the consequences of that debate. People power can make a difference, but we've really got to organise and get our messages out in a way in which we never have before. Because if we don't, we'll basically wake up in a country which is entirely strange to us.